I'm honored, not only that you're here, I'm honored to be on your campus because in many ways our institutions are very different. Georgia State is a different place than the University of Maryland in the type of students we enroll, in their academic background, in their diversity and so forth. So what I'm going to try to do is tell a little bit about what we've done at Georgia State, where, as Ben indicates, we have tried to be as systematic as possible in using data seriously to redesign basic aspects of the institution, and talk about some of those results, and then we can see how applicable some of those programs are and some of the results may be to the context of the University of Maryland and your other institutions if you're not here at College Park. Let me start with national data, though. This is to get us to realize why institutional change is so important. This is from the New York Times. It's actually based on a Stanford study. It's the percent of Americans who hold the bachelor's degree. Covers 1970, far left to the present, but it's disaggregated by economic quartile. And what you can see is there have been significant changes in bachelor's attainment over the last 40 years, almost entirely in the upper half of the economic spectrum. In fact, if you're among the 25% wealthiest Americans by annual household income, the picture has changed dramatically since 1970. Back then, about 40% of the population had a college degree. Now it's up over 80%, so basically doubled over that time period. If you're looking at these lower bands, though, the story is very different. And if you're among the lowest 25% of Americans by annual household income, it's very bleak. I mean, it's a sobering picture that really we should all be ashamed of collectively, that this is not acceptable. That in 40 years, we've moved the needle 2 percentage points, from 6% to 8%. And what you can see really graphically here is the gap is not getting smaller, it's getting far wider. In fact, it's basically doubled over the last 40 years between how the least wealthy and most wealthy Americans do. We all know that's not right. It's not morally right. It's not good economically. It's not good for our society and so forth in all kinds of ways. But the point I want to underline as I start my talk this morning is that it also indicates that significant change is required. We're not going to succeed in moving numbers that haven't budged in 40 years by doing the same old, or even by doing the same old with a couple slight variations. We need to rethink some basic structures and basic approaches to higher education, and only then are we going to expect to get outcomes that are significantly different from what we're looking at here. Now, Georgia State is an interesting testing ground for all this because we are a kind of strange institution. We're a very large public university, so we're 51,000 students now. We've just been consolidated with the largest two-year institution in Georgia, so that's brought us up to 51,000 students. But the main campus, 32,000 students, is located right in downtown Atlanta. If you've been to a conference or convention, you're within a couple blocks of us. We are perhaps most distinguished geographically by being the college or university that's closest to the birthplace of Martin Luther King. So I work literally 4 or 5 blocks from where he was born, his house, the Ebenezer Baptist Church where he and his father preached, and his resting place, his gravesite, is also right along Auburn Avenue there. So we have this proximity to King and the King legacy, but the institution itself had historically not lived up to that legacy at all. Georgia State was segregated well into the 1960s, and even as recently as a couple years ago, despite the growth and the booming and the gleaming glass buildings and so forth that have changed the profile of the campus physically, we were woefully underperforming public university. This is now back in 2003, so a little over a decade ago. Our overall graduation rates at Georgia State hovered around 30%. And we had these persistent and pernicious achievement gaps. So the African American, the Hispanic students, the low-income students, the first-generation students, year after year, semester after semester, were achieving at lower rates, were graduating at lower rates than the white population, than the middle class, and the upper-income students were. And the story of Georgia State over the last decade, that interceding period between when those data were locked in and where we are today, would not give the impression that Georgia State would be the location of a turnaround, because we've gone through significant demographic shifts in Atlanta and in Georgia over this time period. For one thing, we're getting a lot less white and a lot more diverse as far as race and ethnicity is concerned. Back 13 years ago or so, Georgia State was 60% white majority. Now we're as you can see from this chart, 63% non-white. Our largest single population are African Americans. About 40% of our student body is African American. Our two fastest growing groups are actually our Latino and our Asian American students, especially after the '96 Olympics in Atlanta. Lots of immigrant communities began to kind of target Atlanta. We have fast growing first generation immigrant populations, Thai, Vietnamese, and so forth, as well as many from Africa and other nations across the planet. This by far more challenging from my perspective as somebody who's responsible at Georgia State for student success. We've had huge shifts over this time period as well in the economic resources that our students have available. So I think most of you know the marker for low-income student on a federal standard is whether or not they qualify for Pell Grants. Pell, as I think most of you know, the largest federal grant program to support college attendance and hopefully completion for low-income students. Last year in America, the average Pell family came from an annual household income of $23,000 a year. So basically all these Pell students are in this lowest band of that first chart that we were looking at. And what you can see has happened at Georgia State over not even the last decade, but the last 7 or 8 years, is these students have become our majority population. I mean, these are our students. We're situated in Atlanta about 6, 7 blocks from Georgia Tech, a very different type of institution in a different world, where they have a relatively small cohort of low-income Pell students who come in every year. And you know, a couple years ago they got some press for starting, and I completely support it, a targeted program for these students. But you looked at the program, it's 80 students a year. You know, 80 students is, we have over 15,000 Pell students on our downtown campus. We have about 30,000 Pell students on our collective campuses. You know, 80 students, really? You know, is that, it just wouldn't make any impact because it's a different type of institution. These are the students that we're dealing with. And you know, one of the reasons why Georgia State's story gets some attention is this is the leading edge of what's happening nationally. Our population is getting a lot more diverse. Unfortunately, the number and percent of low-income students going up as well. I mean, it's good as from an access perspective that more students are attending college, but we've got to figure out a way to help these students succeed. I was at a presentation by a Georgia demographer a couple months ago, and he was pointing out that you know, this whole state of Georgia is changing dramatically. You don't really think of Georgia as a Latino state, but now Georgia is in the top 10 in the United States for the number of residents who from Hispanic, Latino backgrounds and so forth. And he was asked, well, what's Georgia going to look like by 15 years from now? And his quip was, it's going to look like Georgia State looks today. Because you know, Georgia State is what's happening to the population of Georgia and a lot of other parts of the country. The other little detail that would suggest that we might have trouble turning around our success numbers is the fact that Georgia got clobbered by the recession. Some of the highest unemployment rates, highest default rates in the country, and we lost $40 million in state appropriations between 2008 and 2012. So the point to start with is just this would not be the location that you would identify looking at conventional wisdom for a place that can begin to move these numbers around. We have demographic shifts that would tend to suggest that our graduation rates might be going down. We've had fewer, not more resources to invest. But what we made a commitment to do is recognizing that we wouldn't survive as an institution that is now majority minority and that is majority low income and so forth if we continue to do things the same old way and our graduation rates would continue to decline and so forth. We made a commitment about 10 years ago to really do something that gets lip service in higher education but isn't often executed, which is to take the data seriously and to actually act on it. I've never been to an administrative meeting, and I go to lots of them, where people don't say, oh, we really care about the data. And then I've rarely been in an administrative meeting where they've made a hard decision based on the data. It's often, based on all the other intuitions or pet programs or commitments and so forth that exist. So what we started doing was really collecting the data to diagnose what was the problem our students were having. What was tripping them up? Why weren't they succeeding at levels that were acceptable? We were very willing to pilot new programs, try things out early on. Higher education tends to be very cautious and conservative. We recognized that wouldn't work for us, that the rate our population was shifting. Try some new things, borrow, steal, but put them in place. But use the data carefully to look at what's working and what's not. be willing to revise. And then I put it in red because this is, I think, the biggest single distinction between Georgia State and some of our colleague institutions who have been trying to deal with some of the same demographic changes, is that we have been willing to scale. So it's not that there's a dearth of successful ideas out there in higher education. I visit lots of campuses, and I see all kinds of good things going on, including up the road, the Georgia Tech program for the 80 low-income students coming in this fall and so forth. The challenge, especially at institutions that have large demographic shifts going on, is whether these institutions have a way to commit and to execute these programs at scale. And it's not going to help when you have 51,000 students, of which 30,000 are low income and 28,000 are first generation and 35,000 are non-white, to say we're going to introduce this program that's going to impact 200 students. That's great and helps those 200 students. It's not going to transform the institution and really change outcomes overall. So that's the question is, how can we design things, especially in an age of limited resources, that can be scaled up and impact students on a larger scale. So I'm going to give a couple examples of some of the programs we've introduced and how they've been data inspired. One of the things that we began to discover as we looked at our data more carefully is that we got increasingly good at predicting which students wouldn't make it past the first year. So these are students, by the way, not predominantly remedial. These are students that the state of Georgia has certified as college ready. But when we began to look, and here I'm not talking at all about race, ethnicity, or income level, we began to look at their academic analytics more closely. What grades did they get in key high school classes? How did they do in their junior level math class? How did they do in their lab courses, in English composition and so forth, these kind of classes? And what did those grades indicate when like students from the past came from that high school with those grades and then enrolled at Georgia State? So this whole analytic process I'm going to be describing a lot this morning, but we got more nuanced about it and we began to realize there was a whole group of students who we could pretty much predict were going to have an awfully hard time of getting through the first year. And so the question emerged, well, what do we do? We made a commitment not to do with what some institutions do, which is say, oh, well then we're not going to admit those students because they pull down our SAT scores and they pull down our graduation rates and all those sorts of things, then we get lower ranked in U.S. News and World Report. We have a particular moral dilemma in Georgia because Georgia has this Hope Scholarship. It's a lottery-funded scholarship program where students who maintain a 3.0 GPA in high school and can hold on to the 3.0 in college basically get most of their tuition covered. So it's a really huge incentive for the talented students to stay in the state of Georgia because it's so much cheaper to go to a state school. And that has made the admissions to Georgia Tech and University of Georgia, the other two big research universities in Georgia, ridiculously competitive. This fall at Georgia Tech, the average incoming GPA, high school GPA, is above a 4.0. The average is above a 4.0. The average SAT scores are above 1,400. So the state has, with doing something very good, establishing this program, squeezed all kinds of students out of being able to get into higher ed institutions. It's one of the reasons we've grown as rapidly as we have at Georgia State is, we feel we can't turn our backs. If we turn our backs on the students who we've historically served and so forth, what other alternatives will they have? So what we did instead is change the way we admit these students. Rather than admitting them into the fall class with everybody else and then waiting for a year and then saying, surprise, a year later, half of them, and that was the number, half of these students with this academic profile were gone a year later, debt, but nothing to show for it, no college credential. We were going to send them a different admissions letter. The admissions letter they get now says, welcome to Georgia State for the fall on one condition. You have to come for the summer semester beforehand. This is not a remedial program at all. That's critical in funding it, by the way, because the federal government will not pay federal aid and Pell for remedial programs. These are college credit bachelor's level courses that we put the students in. We like the fact that they start off in classes surrounded by upper class people, by sophomores and juniors. Those are the students who are in the summer program, right? Because the rest of the freshmen haven't arrived yet. So these are students who look and are more like the students who are first enrolling and can model what it means to succeed in a college class and how to behave and so forth. But more, we are able, because during the summer our enrollment is about half of what it is the rest of the year, dedicate our advisors and our tutors and all the other programs to these students. So rather than putting them in the middle of the fall rush, they get off to a much better start. So the results, you can see, they're up on the board, but in a 4-year period, we've only run this program 4 years, with about 400 students a year, we've turned the retention rate for these students from 50% to almost 90%. That's actually a little above our retention rate overall, so these students now are outperforming rather than grossly underperforming the rest of the freshman class. 3 of the 4 years we've run the program, they finished the whole freshman year with a higher GPA than the rest of the freshman class. Another thing that the data showed us, a couple years ago, actually it was more like 5 or 6 years ago when we looked at the data, we found that the average student graduating from Georgia State was going through 2.5 majors before they graduated, okay? We have, I'm sure you, at Maryland you probably have more, we have about 90 undergraduate programs. We have, as you've seen, mostly first-generation low-income students, and we were bringing them into the university and saying, choose. You know, here we have 3,000 courses we're offering this fall, we have 90 majors. You know, basically figure it out. We had some advisors helping and so forth, and I don't want to belittle that, but it was overwhelming to try to make a wise choice. And with no context to do so, and most of these students don't have family members, brothers and sisters and parents who have gone through college, we had set these students up for exactly what we were getting, which students bouncing around. Well, low-income students can't afford to go through 2.5 majors, right? Because they're on limited aid, they're limited eligibility. Every time they switch a major, they're creating certain wasted credit hours. They're creating, you know, a wasted time to degree, but also wasted resources in the process. And for every student that was graduating, we knew there were other students who were falling out and dropping out before they reached the point of graduation because they weren't finding the right major. This was on us. It wasn't on the students. We had created a system that maybe worked for students, you know, 2 generations ago, didn't work for the kind of students we were enrolling today. It's just not reasonable to think that these students can choose between, you know, make good, wise choices between 90 majors. So what we began doing is 2 things. One, we started requiring that all students come into the university in learning communities. There's nothing new or radical about that. The model at Georgia State is groups of 25 take all of their fall classes, and in many cases all of their freshman year classes together. They travel in courses together, so in a couple cases they're the only 25 students in the classroom. Most cases they're 25 students mixed in, but the reason is 51,000 students. It can be very alienating. It's difficult to develop friendships and study partnerships, and we build those sorts of things naturally. If you're the same 25 students in all your classes, you know there's somebody who can give you notes, who you can study with for exams and so forth. So that's been a model that's worked well for us, and it does produce better results just across the board, even before the change that I'm about to tell you about. What we started doing 3 years ago is bringing all the students in, not only in freshman learning communities, but in what we call meta majors. So rather than requiring that they make a pick among these 90 different majors, what we do is as they enter, we slot them into one of these categories. In fact, we have diagnostics and some other platforms, I'll show you one in a minute, that help them think through which of these broad areas they're interested in. Business, health professions, STEM, those sorts of areas. And then they take all of their fall classes with students who are interested in the same meta major, the same broad theme. The advantage here is twofold. One, it allows us to focus the curriculum, so we can guarantee as students coming in, we package their courses. So if you're an incoming business major, even if you haven't decided whether you want to be accounting or marketing or finance, that the courses that we put in that learning community will all apply to any of the business majors, so you won't fall behind. But more importantly, it gives us an identified group of students who we can push programming out. The faculty love this. In fact, business is a good starting point because historically at Georgia State, a lot of the business faculty had focused on our graduate students. We have a large MBA program and PhD programs and so forth, and didn't give so much attention to the undergraduates. Now that there's this defined group, we may have, I don't know, 10 freshman learning communities, 15 freshman learning communities that are business oriented. They know here are the 300 students who are coming in this fall interested in business. They schedule lecture series, they have open houses in the departments, they have meetings with the advisors and so forth in business with the students. The idea is to get the students by the end of the freshman year to make an intelligent decision, and to make a decision that actually sticks, so that they're informed. They know the difference between accounting and finance and marketing, and aren't going to discover in their sophomore and junior year after beginning to take specialized courses, I made the wrong choice. So again, this is just a basic way we've changed the structure of Georgia State based on the data we had. And here's results. We only made this change 3 years ago, but over a 2-year period between 2013 and 2015, we've lowered the number of major changes at Georgia State by almost a third, 30%. Now, if I'm presenting to a group of politicians, our state representatives or our Board of Regents, I would not use this slide because this is not sexy and exciting, but this excites me. I mean, it excites me because the idea that just making a structural change that really cost us nothing, just the way we onboard the students and present our programs, could reduce in a 2-year period by over 30% the number of students bouncing between different majors and all the millions of dollars in tuition savings and time to degree savings that means. That's important, and that shows how significant the changes can be in even a short period of time. This is heavier lifting, but we've gone through our entire curriculum and looked at where the bottlenecks were, what kind of courses are tripping up our students, especially in the freshman and sophomore years. And some of that data can be incredibly sobering when you're serving a population like Georgia State serves, who are mostly the product of a K through 12 system, which by most national rankings is in the bottom couple in the country. So you take the courses that we require students to pass to get their college degree in math. So these are minimum requirements, is to get through either pre-calc, college algebra, intro to stats. 6-7 years ago, the DFW, the percent of students who were getting grades of either D, F, or withdrawing with no grade, over 40% for the entire year. We have over 7,000 seats in these courses every year, and 43% of the students were getting these grades. Again, that model doesn't work at any campus. It certainly doesn't work at a campus that's serving predominantly low-income students, because they can't afford to pay for a class, devote their time to a class, and end up at the end of the semester saying, okay, now I have to do it all over again. And most of these students were coming in, taking their math course their first semester, because that's what freshmen do, and they were getting D's and F's. And then they were having to retake it in the spring semester, and God knows at the time we were doing nothing to make them any more successful the second time than the first time. So they were picking up their second D or F. We were losing hundreds of students every year just because they didn't get through the math requirement. They were losing their scholarships. The Hope Scholarship, as I said, requires you maintain a 3.0 GPA. You have 2 Fs in your freshman year. You're not going to hold on to a 3.0 GPA. So it was a disaster, and again, it was on us, because whoever thought that the best way to teach first-generation low-income college students the most difficult material that many of them will ever have to get through to get their college degree is to create a room, let's make it a little bigger than this one, put somebody up in front of the classroom, have them talk at the students for 3 hours a week, give them a midterm and final, and hope that it all turns out well. And oh, by the way, at Georgia State, and this is absolutely true, over half of our faculty, because we are a research institution, our math faculty are non-native speakers of English. We had just created this, this circumstance where students would not succeed, and they weren't, at least not at rates that were acceptable. So we began a whole stage of piloting and so forth of using flipped classrooms and adaptive learning. We tried things that didn't work. What we eventually settled on that produced better results is a model where students spend 1 hour a week with their professor in a traditional classroom. 3 hours a week they're clocking into dedicated math labs. We have several on these campus. They just serve 24/7 these classes. We found it was important to keep them together as a class. Students individually working on these programs and so forth, not as successful. We found it was important to keep the instructors in the room to answer questions and keep the group together and focused and so forth. But all the students are working at their own pace. They're all sitting there on chapter 3 of pre-calculus, but they're using adaptive learning exercises, so students who are slower are not getting left in the dust. They get more questions to build up at least a basic competency. The more advanced students are not getting bored to tears. They're getting more advanced questions. And I think the biggest thing is all the students are interacting hundreds of times and getting immediate personalized feedback over the course of every hour they're in the lab, when in the past, an entire semester, they were lucky to get a little bit of personalized feedback and so forth. So they're actually doing math and immediately hearing back what they did right or what they did wrong and so forth. And perhaps not surprisingly, given that the old model just doesn't make sense conceptually, the results have been considerably better. They're still far too high, but we've lowered by 35% over a 5-year period the students who are getting grades of D's, F's, and W's. What we've done with a lot of our programs, you heard it about our freshman learning communities, it's true of our flipped classrooms for introductory math. We require it now. There wasn't a single seat among the 7,500 we offered of these 3 classes this past academic year at Georgia State that was offered in traditional lecture format. Because why give students who don't have a context for making an informed decision the ability to make a poor one? If you ask a lot of first-generation low-income students, would you rather sit in the back of this 75-seat, math hall, and the professor will talk up there, and nobody's going to ask you any questions, and nobody's going to know whether you understand? Yeah, they'll take that, or at least a good subset will. But that's not the right choice. And so we've had such success with the math classes, it has had a ripple effect on other departments. We have experiments going on now with adaptive learning components to our introduction to psychology, our micro and macroeconomics, our 2 basic American and world government classes, introductory political science courses and so forth. In fact, we have a structured program which is in part funded by the Gates Foundation to take what are the 10 largest enrolled freshman classes that we offer. Each has over 1,000 seats every academic year, and look at systematically going through them. And it's all faculty-led and faculty-driven, making choices about what we can do to get the students more engaged using adaptive platforms so that the students are getting feedback on a regular basis. In some cases, like the psychology, there's more online component and less face-to-face. In most cases, like the economics and American and world government classes, there's actually more traditional classroom interaction, but students still have the ability to go on these platforms every week and get immediate feedback, put responses in, get adaptive components to the class. And we're beginning to see the psychology is the next wave of significantly reduced failure rates, but we're beginning to see students perform at a much better rate. Yeah?
How did you get faculty to do that?
Yeah, one thing I will say, there's no magic bullet here. So, faculty will go at their own pace, and in any department there'll be some faculty who will be closed to the idea that they're going to change the basic structure of what they're doing. What we found effective at Georgia State is to bring the data to the departments and let them look at what's happening there. Faculty, one thing that links faculty, despite all the diversity out there, is the fact that we're all trained in our PhD programs to respect the evidence. So you provide evidence and it can help change the culture. We very much promote the successes at Georgia State. So our president, our website, our newsletters will brag about these successes, and that creates a little peer pressure as well. But in any department, you'll find some faculty who are sitting there saying, it's really not good if 25% of the students who take introductory psychology are failing or not getting a passing grade. We really, couldn't we do better than that? We don't have any set, standards. It's not like we impose centrally if your failure rate is above 20%, then you have to do this and so forth. It's trying to create a culture of using the data. And I'll say something that is underappreciated. I actually didn't bring a slide on this, but something we've done that in parallel is looking at the structure of academic programs. So one way we trip up students academically is by creating pedagogies that don't serve them very well, or at least don't serve all the students well. Another way is in the way we design the academic programs and the requirements overall. And I'm a long-term faculty member. I'm a professor at Georgia State. I was full-time professor and in the classroom teaching full-time for 20 years. And so for those of you who are not from the academic side, let me let you in on a little secret here. When we have faculty meetings in departments and sit down to discuss things like what should the academic requirements be, or should we add this requirement, or what should the prerequisite be for this particular course, we mostly just make stuff up. That's the technical term. We just mostly make stuff up. I've never been at a faculty meeting where we've sat down when looking at, well, what should the prerequisite for this course be, where we've looked at the data and said, well, what has been the performance of students who have gotten a C in this course versus a B in this course when they take the next, it's just faculty saying, oh, yeah, I think we really need a requirement in this area. And I don't mean to be derogatory here because there are exceptions out there, but I'm pretty convinced that what I'm describing is not too far from what is the norm. Well, you do that over the course of 20 years, and what are the students left with? Bunches of faculty coming into meetings, different new faculty arrive, others leave, they add this requirement, they change that, they move this and so forth. Sometimes you've created these programs that structurally are very difficult for students to navigate, that aren't sensibly conceived, that are not coherent and so forth. So we have another initiative, just like this one, to look at the individual classes, to look at entire degree programs. As a quick example, we've changed our nursing program. Do you have nursing here? Yeah, most nursing programs at the undergraduate level nationally have a 2-year pre-nursing program, and then students are admitted at the beginning of the junior year into the Bachelor's of Nursing program. It's very competitive to make that cut, to go from pre-nursing into the nursing program. At Georgia State, only 20% of the students historically have gotten into the nursing program. And what we found out, those students were doing great. They're graduating above the average for Georgia State. The students who didn't get in were doing terribly. Graduation rates were 25, 30%. And it was just the structural way we had created the program. You can't take low-income students, say, take 2 years worth of specialized courses in pre-nursing to try to get into a nursing program, and then be told at the beginning of your junior year, oh, sorry, pick again, because you didn't make the cut, find another major, and by the way, good luck in funding it, because you've just spent 2 years of your funding on courses mostly that won't apply to your new program. So we had designed this kind of program that didn't fit the success of our students. So we've changed it to a 1-year pre-program. We stack in the first year courses that apply to any major. We use analytics to extrapolate from the student performance in those classes, like introductory math or their first lab course, how they would do if admitted into the nursing program. And then starting in the second year, they begin to take the specialized nursing courses like physiology and anatomy after they're already admitted into the nursing program. And so, again, just us using some analysis of the way we do things to serve the type of students we enroll. Yeah.
Sorry, just looking at the slide. Is that a 35% drop or 15?
It's a 15 percentage point drop, but a 35% drop in the number of students failing. Yeah, you're right. It's a 15 percentage point drop, but if a 15 percentage point drop based on a starting point of 43 is 35.
Yeah, going back to the issue of engaging faculty, historically there have been a certain number of faculty who would look at high PSW rates and say that's a sign that this course is working, that it's a high quality course.
Yep.
Did you have any sense whether over the last few years some of those people have changed their minds, or is that so different a way of looking at things that they're basically not going to come over?
That's a great question, and the question can be turned back on your campus. I can say that there are still pockets of that attitude at Georgia State where there's pride taken in the fact that this class is the hardest to get through at the university, and we fail more students than it. We've tried to move beyond that culture in several ways. The math is a great place to experiment in this realm for the following reason. First thing faculty are going to say when they see these drops in failure rates and so forth is you're dumbing down the curriculum. You've made it easier for students to get through. The reason why these math classes were great testing grounds for this experimental design is that they already all had shared midterms and finals. So the department had committed that you'll have 17 sections of pre-calculus every semester, but all the students will take the same midterm and final. So once we began changing, and initially, of course, we didn't convert all the sections. We started out converting, with 2 sections to adaptive approach and so forth. It was so clear that, the students would get together at midterm and final time, and these students were outperforming, not by a little bit, but by significant amounts, the students in the traditional sections. So that helped diffuse some of that and won over a number of the math faculty, but we still do have that skepticism out there. My background I'm a professor of religious studies. I actually teach comparative religious ethics. I do sometimes pull the moral card, but I believe it. I believe it. This idea that in this day and age, with the kind of students we enroll at Georgia State, but you enroll at your institutions as well, including here in College Park, that we could be admitting them when we know they're going to take on this huge amount of debt that they're going to be paying off for years and years. We also know from all the data that the students who have the biggest challenge in paying off the debt are not the students with the greatest amount of debt, but the students with debt who don't get a degree. Okay? So if we really follow this model that we're doing a good job if we fail a third of the students or fail 40% of the students, it's just a disastrous model for the individual students. And we shouldn't be admitting them into the university in the first place if we think that we're going to weed them out. We have one of the largest supplemental instruction programs in the country. Again, not particularly revolutionary. What we did is looked at all the courses with the highest failure rates across the curriculum. What was perhaps a little different in the use of data is we not only used the data to identify the bottleneck courses in the freshman and sophomore years, we have an asset at Georgia State, which is because we have so many low-income students, we have lots of students who are on federal work study. So they're paid as part of their federal grants in order to work for the university. In the past, we were mostly finding things for students to do. You know, they'd sit in the front desk and answer phones, or they'd shelve books at the library. Now we're looking at the data to find students, undergraduate students on work study who have succeeded in the same classes that are tripping up other students. We pull them out of their current work assignments. We actually pay them to go through training. We pay them to sit in on the same undergraduate class they succeeded in previously so they get to know the new students and the instructor. And we pay them to do these instructional sessions throughout the semester. We're using card swipes, so we have these little readers attached to all the computers as they come in so that we can get all the demographic details. And we found a lot of interesting things. One is the students who show up for supplemental instruction taught by a fellow undergraduate are very different from the students who show up for office hours. There are all kinds of cultural barriers to a low-income first-generation student knocking on a professor's door and saying, "I'm lost, I don't understand anything you're saying." It takes a certain entitlement to be willing to say, you know, it's on you, I don't understand what's going on, you explain to me better, and a lot of first-generation low-income students will never do that. But they're much more likely to come to a session taught by a fellow undergraduate. Oftentimes the faculty members themselves now are helping identify really talented students from previous semesters who can serve this role. It's great for the instructors themselves, the student instructors, the tutors themselves. Their graduation rates have gone up by about 15 percentage points because they're spending dedicated time being mentored by a faculty member but also working to teach material they know. And if a student attends at least 3 of these sessions for an individual class, they're doing about half a letter grade better. This is a very small sample of the courses that we offer supplemental instruction for. This past spring semester, the one that just ended, we had 550 courses that had supplemental instructors connected with it. Relatively low-cost program. Paying for the tutors is mostly already covered by the federal government through the work study program. We have a full-time person staff that does the training and organizes the assignments and so forth. But again, the trick is scale. We had about 10,000 students this past academic year who availed themselves and attended at least 3 sessions for a single course. That was the chart I was going to show you describing the academic programs. Yeah, sure.
You mentioned their graduation rates went up, which didn't surprise me because I have this theory that sitting in on the same course twice, you actually learn much more, even if you got an A in it the first time.
I think you're right.
And I'm wondering if there's any way to imply that insight.
Yeah.
To ask students to sit in the same course twice is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Credits in other areas. Is there any way to expand that double teaching idea?
That's a great point. That's an interesting idea. The only thing I would add, the caveat, is it may not just be purely sitting in on the class a second time, but actually then turning around and in structured sessions teaching the material. And I'm not sure, if that's my suspicion is that might be the bigger gain, but we haven't really done an analysis that could break that down. But you're right. Are there creative ways to get students to have those kind of experiences more often? You get the mentoring with a faculty member, you get the experience of teaching material. It's not required that the course be in the student's major, but often it works that way, that this is a course that the student is majoring and so forth. So, it makes real sense as a model, and it's just a different way of structuring that experience. One last point before I get to advising, and advising will be my last major program to describe, is financial intervention. So here's another thing that we saw in the data, which was a little shocking and disturbing a few years ago. We were dropping over 1,000 students a semester who were registered for classes but couldn't cover their tuition and fees. So with all the low-income students we enroll, Georgia is particularly hard-nosed about this. By the end of the first week of classes, students have to pay 100% of their tuition and fees for the semester, or it's considered an illegal gratuity that we're providing to the students by educating with them without providing all their tuition and fees. And then we looked at the data. Who were we dropping? And it was disturbing. It's always disturbing when you drop students who are registered, because that's the whole point, is get them qualified to register and wanting to register for classes. But we found the biggest single group within the students we were dropping were actually seniors. And that defies one bit of retention logic, because it is true at most institutions, almost every institution, that more freshmen drop out than sophomores, more sophomores than juniors, and so forth. But here, this was really hitting the seniors, and you probably can already extrapolate why. These seniors were running out of eligibility for different types of aid. The Hope Scholarship that I've been describing only covers 127 credit hours. You need a minimum of 120 credit hours to get a bachelor's degree. So lots of students, you drop a course or fail a course or two, you're running out of your scholarship before you reach the point of graduating. But more than that, we're the biggest transfer recipient school in Georgia. 60% or 57% of our undergraduates are transfer students. And so they would bounce around to different institutions. By the time they got to us, a lot of them have used up their Pell eligibility and so forth. So these are students doing everything right. You know, they're close to graduating. In some cases, they had above a 3.0 GPA, and we were dropping them. We didn't do a study along these lines, but a California study showed that if a student stops out of college, they only have about a 32% chance of ever coming back and re-enrolling. And we would see this anecdotally, because the students, to a person, would never say, I'm stopping out because I don't have the money to cover it, and I'm giving up on my dreams of getting a college degree. Their plan was, I'm going to get a job, I'm going to earn enough money to live on and save the thousands of dollars I need to cover my tuition and fees, and then I'll come back. And you know all know how well that works. You're a low-income, first-generation student of color who, in the eyes of the workplace, is a college dropout, right? You don't have a college degree. You're going to find a job that allows you to, earn enough to live on and to earn enough to save and come back to college. So this was a disastrous kind of, and really tragic, circumstance, where these students so close to the finish line. We spent all this time working with K through 12 to get students college prepared. We spent all this time in the freshman year getting them through their math classes and getting them into a major. Here you have students that are 2 semesters away from graduating, and they're walking away. So we started now 3.5 years ago this microgrant program. Students do not have to apply. We're looking at the data right before the fee drop occurs, which is usually the Friday at the end of the first week of classes. We're looking for 2 data points. One is, do the students have genuine unmet need by federal standards? Are they under-packaged for the expense of their college education? And secondly, are they on track for graduation? They don't have to be scholars. They can have a 2.0 GPA, but are they taking the right courses and progressing? And we have some analytics I'll show you next in that category. If they meet those 2 criteria and they're below $1,500 in the gap of what they need to pay, we just put the money in their account. Nothing needed to be signed or anything. We just put in the account. The first couple semesters we did this, we were calling up students to let them know we had done it so they wouldn't make other plans for Monday morning, because we knew they might think, well, I didn't cover it, so I'm out of my classes. And we had students hanging up on us because they thought it was a scam. They couldn't believe anybody from Georgia State had I just gave you $900. They didn't believe it, which is kind of sad in and of itself. And what we found is we do require the students who get these grants, they don't have to pay them back, obviously, they are grants, but they do have to come in and sit down with a financial counselor to talk about how to finance whatever remaining part of their career or academic careers they have. They meet with an academic advisor to plot out the most efficient way of getting to the graduation point so they're not taking any excess credit hours. And you can see, 70% of these kids are graduating within 2 semesters. 70%. What other program for $900 on average can get you a 70% completion rate? But it's just trying to understand via the data where the students' needs are and making a difference. This program pays for itself, and that's been the most refreshing thing about it. We've now given in 3.5 years over 7,000 of these grants. How could we afford that? Because what you're doing is these grants cover tuition and fees, giving the students on average $900, getting $900 immediately back. Great. You didn't lose anything in the exchange. But more than that, the average bill that a student had when they had the $900 gap on average was $2,500. So you not only get the $900 back, you get the $1,600 back that the student has already put in towards their account. So this is, from the perspective of our financial officer on campus, this is a revenue positive program. At the same time, from my perspective, it's, a very important retention program. Our biggest change, and the last program I'll talk about this morning formally, is what we've done with academic advising. We looked several years ago and found that, and this is very close to true, almost 100% of our advising resources were going to students whose material outcome was not changed by the advice they were getting. And this is not a rap on our advisors. It's the fact that our advisors were overwhelmed, high need population, and they were trying to respond to the students who were bombarding them with requests every day. And they ended up seeing predominantly two groups of students. One, the honor students, the A students, the conscientious students who would fight through the lines or make appointments and get every T crossed and I dotted on a regular basis. The challenge there is most of these students would have graduated whether the advisor ever met with them or not. The other group they were seeing were the students on academic probation because, like most universities, we had policies that said they had to see their advisor. These were students below a 2.0 GPA. They would have to get their schedules signed off on and so forth. And when we looked at the data, I'd like to be able to report otherwise, but the reality is very, very few of these students ever graduated. So we had this big office with all these resources and all these intelligent people trying to help, and it really wasn't helping students graduate. So we decided what we needed was a way of identifying the students whose outcomes we could impact. What about the C student, the B- student? The right advice at the right time might actually convert them from a college dropout to a college graduate. How can we get them the advice they need in a timely fashion? There was really no product out there to help us do this. So we collaborated with a company out of Washington, D.C. called Education Advisory Board, EAB, and helped them develop a system which they're now marketing. We wisely didn't take any cut of that, so we're not making any profit whatsoever from it. We used 10 years of our data, 2.5 million grades, 140,000 student records. What we did with this kind of big data set is an analysis to try to find historically what have students done academically that correlates in a statistically significant way to them flunking out or dropping out. Okay, so what kind of behaviors recurred in the past that correlated to dropout rates? And the system is really simple in concept. Now we take those things and look for them every day in our student information system for all 51,000 students we enroll. Now, unfortunately, we found over 800 things. So what this technology does is look for these 800 things in our student information system every night. When one of the things is detected, a flag goes off, and the alert goes directly to the advisor who is assigned to that student. And then we have protocols for them, for the advisor, reaching out to the student within 48 hours with some kind of intervention, some kind of mediation. Let me give you examples. One of the things that the system does is track registration. Very simple, but very important, especially with the students we enroll. Most campuses, I would imagine you do here at College Park, have these program maps. This is the description of what you need to take each semester to get through each major. This is our chemistry map, shows the required courses that a chemistry major will need to take each semester to graduate in 4 years. Very nice. We've had these for over a decade. The problem is the students who were following these program maps were largely those same A students who were, making the time to meet with their advisors and get the T's crossed and the I's dotted, that the middle students oftentimes were not paying enough attention, and we weren't doing anything to make sure that the students were signing up for the right classes. The registration period at Georgia State is about 4 months long before every semester. Tens of thousands of interactions going on. Nobody was paying any attention. So now we're monitoring this every single night. And if a student signs up for a class that doesn't apply to their major, doesn't apply to their degree map or plan, an alert goes off. Doesn't mean that a chemistry student can't take a course in Roman architecture. Does mean they're going to know from somebody at Georgia State that that course in Roman architecture will be extra, doesn't count as an elective for your program, you're going to pay for it, and it's not going to apply to your degree. And not surprisingly, once we've begun telling students this, in 90% of the cases, they've said, oh, I didn't know that. I thought it did apply, and have made changes before the first day of class. There's the predictive analytics part of it. Here's an example, a fairly simple example, but we're running these kind of analyses of what the data tells us about success rates of past students. We found, for instance, that the first grade that a student gets in his or her major is highly predictive of their chances of graduating on time. We've run this for every major at Georgia State, but if you're a political science major, get an A or B in your first political science class, you're graduating on time at over a 75% clip, which is great for us at Georgia State. If you get a C in that first class, you're graduating at a 25% clip. But what historically had we done with that C student? Worse than nothing. We did nothing, but it was worse than that because for first-generation low-income students, we were giving them false information. We were saying, you got a C in your first class, now you qualify to take upper-level work. Well, what would happen? Whatever weakness is evidenced in that C grade becomes exacerbated when they take the upper-level political science course. So if they have reading issues or writing issues, the demands are much greater at the next level, and the grades turn to D's and F's, and they accumulate enough D's and F's, and then we would intervene. Well, that's backwards. I mean, why are we waiting till the student wastes time and money and gets a bunch of bad grades when the data shows us that there's a problem that needs to be tended to more quickly? So now the system is simple. That, when one of these sorts of grades is registered, there's an alert that goes off, the student is engaged. The advisor will sit down with the student. They may take out the exams from the class, look at what the instructor said, may go to the writing center, may get tutoring, may go to supplemental instruction, may even take an entirely new course in order to build up more background. For instance, in some of our STEM fields, we have students taking additional math courses before they try the upper level work. But it's much better to do that, even if it's a short detour, than to sit back and let a lot of D's and F's be accumulated and then try to intervene. We have what is called a major matcher. So what it does is look at that historical data, look at the grades that any individual student has gotten in specific classes, and maps out the probability based on historical records that the student will succeed in each major. So the gray area are the courses that the student has already taken and the grades received for each of the majors. The white are the remaining required courses and the predictive analytics for how difficult these courses will be for the students. We actually share this with the student. It's always mediated, but the advisor sits down with the student and says, let's talk about this. Where could you apply the courses you've taken more fully? If you're moving majors, what barriers remain? What difficulties will you face? When we first launched this, our faculty, those that were critics, and they weren't the majority by any means, but those that were critics said, this is a system for moving students to easier majors. So you're going to sit down with students systematically, talk about where they're going to succeed. They're going to all end up in, and you can fill in the gap because I will lose if I try to do so. Whatever you think is the easiest major on campus, they will all end up there. And what we found doing this tens of thousands of times over the last 4 years is just the opposite. Our two fastest growing majors are computer science and biology. Nobody at Georgia State thinks those are among our easiest majors. Why? Because we're giving these students a fighting chance. You see the profile of the students we enroll. In the past, they would come in and say, I want to be a chemistry major pre-med. And we would shove them into the deep end of the pool. And if by their own ability or whatever they picked up in K through 12 they could survive, oh, good for us, we've got this low-income student through the chemistry major. And if they sunk, it was their fault or K through 12's fault. Now we're giving them a fighting chance because as early as 2 and 3 weeks in the semester, there are alerts going off. If a student is not attending or not doing well in early quizzes, we know that. There's an intervention that occurs. The advisor engages. There's supplemental instruction. There's tutoring. There's a math center and so forth. And we're giving these students a chance to succeed. And so the system that was supposedly going to move students to easier majors is actually now allowing students at much higher levels to succeed in the majors they envision themselves pursuing when they enroll or when they make that decision. We have direct links in the platform to career data, live career data through a vendor called Burning Glass. Students can see empirically what careers are most likely to result from completing undergraduate majors in any area. So if you're biology, it's biochemist, biological technician, and so forth. Whole list there of majors. This is critical for first-generation students who often have a very limited experience with what you can do with a college degree. For any career they're interested in, biochemists, they can see live data about job demand, starting salaries, what kind of credentials you need in order to pursue that particular career. But the trick here is scale. So over the last 12 months at Georgia State, we've had over 49,000 one-on-one interactions between our advisors and our students that were prompted from alerts coming out of the system. 49,000 of these things being corrected, hopefully, that in the past were going basically unnoticed and untended to. We saw immediately when we went live with this system, we went live in summer of 12, a significant increase in the overall progression rates of our students. The big gains did not come with the first-time full-time freshmen who are already getting white glove treatment, a lot of attention. The big gains came with our transfer students, our part-time students, our adult learners, our military learners, all these students who don't tend to, one, have much experience figuring out how to navigate a big bureaucracy like the University of Maryland, but two, don't in the past have day-to-day support and guidance to be watching out for whether they're making decisions that are wise ones or not. Every year since we've been live with the system, we've seen students attempting a higher number of credit hours each semester and passing a higher percentage of the credit hours they attempt, which, at least some outsiders would say is counterintuitive. If you're taking more credit hours, you're going to do less well, but the students are taking more credit hours and passing a higher percent of what they're taking. And then I'm really pleased with this one too, which is we're beginning to see significant declines in time to degree. So we, like you, have lots and lots of transfer students. A couple years ago, the average student to get through all their degree programs who graduated from Georgia State was accumulating 140 plus credit hours for a degree program that requires 120 credits. That's, thousands, if not tens of thousands of additional dollars that the students are spending, as well as wasted time. What's happened since we've gone to scale with this approach and all these interventions is we've begun to see some significant declines. So over the last 2 years alone, the graduating class of 13 compared to 15, the class of 15 took 6 fewer credit hours to amass all the requirements that they needed in order to graduate. That's savings of about $10 million for the class of 15 compared to 13 in tuition and fees. And the biggest gains we've seen have come from at-risk populations. So just as an example, our African American STEM majors in 2 years have gone from requiring 150 to 138 because we're correcting things that in the past would go unattended. Ooh, you took the wrong lab sequence. Now you have to go back and redo the lab sequence for chem majors. Now we're finding that out beforehand, or we're fitting students into the right majors, or we're getting them the right help, tutoring, and otherwise when they need it. We've got new things coming on board. This fall we're launching a platform, a portal for all students that will allow them, for whatever major they pick, to see job stats, career data, salaries, number of jobs available, and so forth. For cognate careers, to get them thinking about, if you're interested in nursing, maybe you want to think about radiology or public health or health informatics. We have a program that we're piloting for our 2-year students, our associate students, that once they pick a major, will pull from their program map a recommended schedule of classes, all that apply to their progression in the major. They can then go into an Outlook-like calendar, block out commute times and work times and so forth, and the system will go into Banner School, go into Banner, pull out the courses that are on their recommended list, and put forth a recommended calendar that fits with their schedule. They can then actually scroll through 2 or 3 different versions of this. Again, the idea, let's minimize the kind of costly but simple mistakes that students are making at scale by signing up for the wrong classes. We've moved to a career-based e-portfolio. One of the issues we have at Georgia State is how you professionalize 51,000 students, most of whom are low-income first-generation college students. And now, starting this fall, every student as they come into the university will have this career-based e-portfolio. They'll be populating from their first semester artifacts that show that they're building competencies in areas like communication or leadership skills and so forth. Allow them to post YouTube videos, graphic files, audio files. It will download seamlessly into LinkedIn, so any artifact they put in their Georgia State ePortfolio, they can then populate their LinkedIn pages with those artifacts so anybody can have access to them from that platform. We're experimenting with using notifications via smartphones and actually intelligent text messaging systems that text students automatically and respond to basic student questions automatically. We're doing all this not because we're well-resourced, you've heard that, but because doing this well can really pay for itself. At Georgia State, every 1% on the Atlanta campus, which is our main downtown campus, we increase retention rates. That's an additional 300 students being enrolled. The average student bill over a 12-month period at Georgia State is around $9,800. So if you can hold on to 300 more students who otherwise might have dropped out, that's over $3 million of continuing revenue. And that's been our model, not by getting a lot of grants and not by getting the state to support these programs, but by recognizing the business model going forward for institutions in the public sphere who have declining state appropriations is to do better by our students, and as a result have added revenues coming in. This has been great for Georgia State. It's gotten us lots and lots of national attention in ways that we hadn't before. There was just a nice article on Georgia State 2 weeks ago in the Sunday Times. We've got PBS NewsHour coming to film a spot this past week, which will be airing over the next couple weeks and so forth. That's been great for us. We got invited to the White House. I talk about a heady experience, sit 20 feet away from the President of the United States who's talking about your programs and so forth. That's been very, very gratifying and surrealistic and so forth. But this is why we're doing it. Over the last 5 years, we're graduating now 1,700 more students every year. Despite all those demographic shifts that would say those numbers should be going down, we're graduating 1,700 more students, 30% more than we were 5 years ago. Over the same time period, our enrollments have grown by 3%. So we're succeeding with the students we enroll. We've actually had to move our commencement ceremony from the basketball arena on campus. We're about 5 blocks away from the Georgia Dome. That's where the Falcons play, and we're filling up the Georgia Dome. In fact, this was a year ago. This year, this is the top layer. We began filling up the seats in the top layer of the Georgia Dome as well. Very gratifying. But look where the gains have come. So 30% increase overall. This is the same time period. Conferrals are up. Almost all of the gains have come from the students who in the past had struggled. We're up 80% in degrees conferred to African Americans, 90% to Pell students, 120% in the degrees we're conferring to our Hispanic and Latino students. The graduation rates show the same sort of thing. The blue is where we were back in 2003. This is where we are now. Not good enough by any means, but we're not talking about modest increases. We're talking about graduation rates doubling. And again, the biggest gains have come for the students who are most at risk in the past. We used to have a strong achievement gap with the white students outperforming. Now, the biggest gains have come to African American and Latino students. In fact, the news is even better when you track that same cohort represented in the red across all universities. So one thing I think is underappreciated when people talk about institutional graduation rates is that low-income students tend to be much more transient than their middle and upper-income counterparts. They move around more, they gain jobs, lose jobs, their family gains and lose jobs. They move around a lot more. So what we do with the green is start with all the students who are represented and came to Georgia State at the same time represented by the red and say, did they graduate from Georgia State or from some other institution? And what you can see is that the students are graduating at, for the type of students we enroll, very good rates, over 75%, in fact over 76% on average, and there's absolutely no difference in performance between white students, African American and Hispanic students over that time period. Georgia State is the only public university this year in the United States at which the low-income first-generation Black and Latino students are all graduating at or above the rate of the student body overall. So these programs do make a big transformative difference. Another interesting distinction that Georgia State has attained via these programs is for each of the last 4 years, Georgia State has conferred more bachelor's degrees to African Americans than any other college or university in the United States. It's the first time in U.S. history that that's been a non-HBCU. And it's specifically because these sorts of interventions. This was the first year that we attained that status 4 years ago, and at that point we were conferring 1,200 degrees a year, and now we're up to 1,800. These are making huge differences on the type of students that historically American higher education has failed. Last slide here. This just goes back to national data where we started. This is comparison between the percent of a student body at a university that are Pell eligible versus graduation rates. Each of the diamonds is a national university. And you can see there's this steep correlation. As Pell rates go up, as the percent of students on a campus on Pell go up, graduation rates go down steeply. 6 years ago, Georgia State was actually below the dotted line. And what's happened for the past 5-6 years is every year as these programs have taken hold and been scaled up, we've become more and more of an outlier. And at this point, among all our peer institutions, among a group of 12 large urban research universities, we have the highest Pell rate and the highest graduation rate. And conventional wisdom says that shouldn't be the case. But of course, that's what we need to combat, is the conventional wisdom. Because the conventional wisdom has gotten us to where we are today. It has many good things about higher education in America, but we all know there are many problems in higher education in America. And the story of Georgia State is not one that fits every campus. The type of students you enroll here at Maryland are very different as they're coming into the university in many ways, but you do face some of the same challenges. You have persistent achievement gaps. They're, to your credit, smaller than at many like institutions, but it is still the case that African American students, Pell students, first generation students are graduating at lower rates. So, we're happy to answer questions and to talk about, what might be borrowed from this example, what might be not as applicable, but, hopefully together we can take some responsibility for saying that it's not on the students, it's not all demographics, and, we can make a significant difference. So thanks very much for your attention.